Welcome to Sci-Fi Verse. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on new videos, and enjoy the listening. Galacta-High wasn't just a school. It was a hub of intergalactic cultures, a melting pot of species from across the known universe. Every corner of its massive campus teemed with life forms ranging from the gaseous Florin of the Oort cloud to the crystalline Kryluxians from the distant nebulae. The architecture reflected this diversity, with buildings that shifted form to accommodate different gravitational needs, and hallways that widened or narrowed based on the size of those walking through them. Nate Harrison, the latest transfer from Earth, stepped into the grand atrium and was immediately swallowed by the sensory overload. His breath caught in his throat as he gazed up at the ceiling, which seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, shimmering with light from distant stars. The walls pulsed with energy, displaying holographic images of various planetary systems, each one more vibrant than the last. Nate was used to feeling out of place, but this was on another level. Humans were a minority at Galacta-High and everyone knew it. Back on Earth, he'd been just another kid, but here he was an anomaly, a squishy, soft-bodied human in a sea of beings with exoskeletons, scales, and wings. He felt the stares as soon as he walked through the doors. Eyes, some of them on stalks, some glowing, and some multifaceted, followed his every move. He adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder, trying to ignore the murmurs around him. "Stick to the plan," he muttered under his breath, a mantra he'd repeated to himself countless times before moving to Galacta-High. His dad's job as a diplomat had brought them to this part of the galaxy, and while Nate had never been the type to shy away from a challenge, this was something else entirely. As he walked through the crowd, he noticed a group of students gathered near the entrance to what looked like the main hall. They were clustered around something that was speaking loudly enough for Nate to hear over the ambient noise of the atrium. And I told him, "If you can't lift that weight, you're better off in the med bay than on the grav sled team." The voice was deep, rumbling with the kind of arrogance that immediately grated on Nate's nerves. Pushing through the crowd, he caught his first glimpse of Zorvak, the school's reigning bully. Zorvak was massive, easily 10 feet tall, with a body that looked like it had been chiseled from solid rock. His 4 muscular arms were folded across his chest, and his 6 glowing yellow eyes scanned the crowd, daring anyone to challenge him. Nate had heard of Zorvak even before he arrived at Galacta-High. The stories painted him as a terror who ruled through fear, picking on anyone weaker than himself, which, given his size and strength, included just about everyone. Rumor had it that Zorvak had once ripped a locker door off its hinges and used it as a shield during a fight, just to prove he could. "Hey, look who it is," Zorvak said, his voice cutting through the crowd like a blade. The students parted, revealing Nate standing there, trying his best to remain unfazed. A new squishy. "What's the matter, human? You lost." The crowd snickered. Nate felt a dozen pairs of eyes on him, waiting to see how he'd react. He was the new kid, the outsider, and everyone knew it was only a matter of time before Zorvak made his move. "Nope," Nate replied evenly, meeting Zorvak's gaze. "I'm right where I'm supposed to be." There was a brief silence, as if the crowd was collectively holding its breath. Then Zorvak laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed off the walls. "You've got guts, human. Too bad they're about to be spilled all over the floor." Nate felt his heart rate quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd been in situations like this before, well, not exactly like this, but close enough. The key was to stay cool, not let them see you sweat. He'd spent the last few months training, learning everything he could about the different species at Galacta-High, their strengths, their weaknesses. He wasn't about to let some overgrown lizard intimidate him. "Maybe," Nate said, taking a step closer to Zorvak, "but I've always found that it's not the size of the muscles that matters. It's how you use them." The crowd let out an audible gasp. Zorvak's eyes narrowed, his grin fading into a scowl. For a moment it looked like he might attack right then and there. But then he relaxed, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "After school," Zorvak said, his voice low and menacing. "Anti-grav courts. Don't be late." Nate nodded. "I'll be there." With that, Zorvak turned and walked away, his entourage following close behind. The crowd began to disperse, students whispering excitedly about the showdown that was sure to come. Nate let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and continued down the hallway toward his first class. Galacta-High's classrooms were as varied as its students. Nate's first class, Galactic History, was held in a chamber that seemed to shift its shape depending on the needs of the lesson. Today it resembled a vast amphitheater with floating platforms for students who couldn't fit in traditional seating. The walls were lined with holographic displays depicting ancient battles, treaties, and significant moments in galactic history. Nate found a seat near the middle, trying not to attract too much attention. As he settled in, the holographic image of a Tzorkian battlecruiser faded into view above the center of the room. The teacher, a towering insectoid creature with translucent wings and compound eyes, began to drone on about the significance of the Tzorkian War of Ascension. Nate tried to focus on the lecture, but his mind kept drifting back to Zorvak. He knew he had to be smart about this. Zorvak was big, strong, and had a reputation to maintain. But Nate wasn't just some clueless kid who'd wandered into the wrong school. He'd done his homework. He knew that Zorvak's species, the Tridonians, had a few key weaknesses pressure points that, if hit correctly, could incapacitate even the toughest warrior. He'd spent weeks practicing strikes, honing his speed and precision. Still, Nate knew that fighting Zorvak head-on would be suicide. He needed an edge, something that would level the playing field. That's why he'd brought the satchel. Inside were a few gadgets he'd put together over the last few months, nothing fancy, just some basic tech that could give him an advantage. A neural disruptor, a gravity modulator, and a small personal shield generator were among the tools at his disposal. The class dragged on, and Nate did his best to absorb the information, but the tension in the pit of his stomach wouldn't go away. He knew what was waiting for him after school, and no amount of galactic history was going to take his mind off it. When the bell finally rang, Nate packed up his things and headed to his next class, xenobiology. This one was held in a greenhouse-like environment, with plants from dozens of different planets growing in carefully controlled sections. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell of alien flora filled his nose. As the lesson began, Nate found himself paired with a student from the planet Nixes, a small, furry creature with large, expressive eyes and a tendency to chatter excitedly about whatever caught its interest. The Nixian introduced itself as Jex and immediately began quizzing Nate about Earth. "You're from the blue planet, right?" Jex asked, bouncing on its tiny feet. "What's it like? Do you really have liquid water everywhere? And I heard your species breathes oxygen, is that true?" Nate smiled, grateful for the distraction. "Yeah, we do. Earth's mostly water, actually, and oxygen's kind of our thing." Jex's eyes widened. "Amazing. My species breathes nitrogen, but we can tolerate oxygen in small amounts. Your planet must be fascinating. I'd love to visit someday." "Maybe you will," Nate said, genuinely warming up to the little creature. "Just make sure to bring an umbrella. It rains a lot." They spent the rest of the class working together on a project involving the cross-pollination of alien plants, and Nate found himself relaxing a little. Jex was full of questions, but they were more curious than invasive, and it was nice to talk to someone who didn't see him as just another squishy. By the time the final bell rang, Nate felt a little more at ease, though the looming confrontation with Zorvak was never far from his mind. He said goodbye to Jex and made his way to the anti-grav quartz. The anti-grav quartz were a marvel of engineering. Suspended platforms floated above a chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness below. Hoverball was the most popular sport here, a fast-paced game that involved players zipping between platforms in zero gravity, trying to score points by launching glowing orbs through energy rings. But today the courts weren't being used for sports. Today they were the stage for what had quickly become the most anticipated event of the week. Word had spread like wildfire, and by the time Nate arrived, the platforms were packed with students eager to see how the human would fare against Zorvak. Zorvak stood in the center of the main platform, his arms crossed, a smug grin plastered on his face. His entourage, an assortment of equally intimidating aliens, flanked him, hyping him up and making sure everyone knew just how badly Nate was about to get destroyed. Nate stepped onto the platform, his heart hammering in his chest. He glanced around at the crowd, noting the mix of expressions: curiosity, amusement, pity, and even a few sympathetic looks. He locked eyes with Zorvak, who sneered down at him. "Ready to learn your place?" Human Zorvak growled, cracking his knuckles. "Let's get this over with," Nate replied, keeping his voice steady. The crowd fell silent as the two squared off. The tension was palpable. Nate knew he couldn't afford to get hit, not even once. Zorvak's strength was overwhelming, and a direct blow would end the fight immediately. But Nate had something Zorvak didn't: speed, intelligence, and a plan. Zorvak wasted no time. He charged at Nate with terrifying speed, swinging all four fists in a coordinated assault. But Nate was ready. He sidestepped the first swing, ducked under the second, and rolled out of the way of the double backhand that would have sent him flying off the platform. The crowd gasped in surprise. No one had ever dodged Zorvak's opening attack. "Quit running," squishy Zorvak bellowed, his voice laced with frustration. Nate smirked. "Catch me if you can." Zorvak lunged again, this time feinting left before swinging right, trying to catch Nate off guard. But Nate had been watching Zorvak's movements closely, analyzing his attack patterns. He ducked under the swing and planted a quick strike to Zorvak's ribcage, targeting a pressure point he'd identified during his research. Zorvak grunted in pain but quickly shook it off, more annoyed than hurt. "Oh, you've got tricks," Zorvak snarled. "Let's see how long you can keep it up." Nate danced around the platform, using his smaller size and agility to stay out of reach. Zorvak's swings grew more erratic as his frustration mounted, but Nate wasn't just playing defense. Every time he dodged, he struck back small, precise hits aimed at key points in Zorvak's anatomy. The crowd watched in disbelief as the fight dragged on. Zorvak was used to finishing his opponents quickly, but Nate was playing a different game entirely. Finally, Nate decided it was time to put his plan into action. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small device, one of the gadgets he'd been working on. It was a neural disruptor, designed to interfere with Zorvak's motor control. With a flick of his wrist, he activated the device and tossed it onto Zorvak's back. The disruptor latched on with a soft click. Zorvak froze, his eyes widening as his limbs suddenly jerked uncontrollably. He tried to steady himself, but his movements were erratic and uncoordinated. The crowd gasped as the mighty bully struggled to stay upright. "What did you do?" Zorvak roared, his voice slurred as his body betrayed him. Leveling the playing field, Nate said calmly, "You rely too much on brute force. Time to see how you do when that's taken away." With Zorvak off balance, Nate moved in, delivering a series of rapid strikes to the pressure points he'd identified earlier. Each hit sent jolts of pain through Zorvak's body, weakening him further. The crowd couldn't believe what they were seeing. Zorvak, the unstoppable juggernaut, was being systematically taken apart by a human. But Nate knew he couldn't let his guard down. Even weakened, Zorvak was still dangerous. One wrong move, and it could all be over. As Zorvak lashed out with a desperate swing, Nate dodged and delivered a powerful kick to the back of Zorvak's knee, sending him crashing to the ground. Zorvak's roar of frustration echoed across the chasm as he struggled to get back up. But his body wouldn't cooperate. The neural disruptor had done its job, and Nate's precise strikes had left him too weak to stand. The mighty bully was down, and the crowd erupted into cheers and gasps of disbelief. Nate stepped back, breathing heavily but refusing to show any sign of fatigue. He looked down at Zorvak, who glared up at him with a mix of rage and something else, respect. "You underestimated me because I'm human," Nate said, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "That was your first mistake. Your second was assuming strength is all that matters." Zorvak clenched his fists, but he didn't have the strength to retaliate. For a moment it looked like he might spit out another threat, but instead he let out a defeated growl and slumped to the ground. Nate extended a hand. "We can keep this going, or we can be done. Your call." There was a long pause as the crowd held its breath, waiting to see what Zorvak would do. Finally, with a grudging snarl, Zorvak took Nate's hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. "This isn't over," human Zorvak muttered, his pride clearly wounded. "Maybe not," Nate replied, "but next time, try thinking before you fight." As Nate walked away, the crowd parted, whispering excitedly. The legend of the human who took down Zorvak would spread quickly. But for Nate, this was just the beginning. He knew that Galacta-High had plenty of other challenges waiting for him, and he was ready to face them head-on. The next day at Galacta-High, things felt different. The usual chatter in the hallways was now centered on one thing: Nate's fight with Zorvak. News spread fast on the school's interconnected neural network, with video clips of the showdown circulating among students. The footage was being analyzed frame by frame, with everyone trying to figure out how a squishy had managed to take down the school's most feared bully. As Nate walked into the main atrium, he felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him. Whispers followed him everywhere. "That's the human who beat Zorvak. Did you see how he dodged those punches?" I heard he used some kind of neural device. What a cheat. But it wasn't all admiration. Zorvak's reputation may have taken a hit, but he still had loyal followers, especially the other bullies who relied on his protection. These were the ones Nate had to watch out for. As much as Nate had won the fight, he knew this was only the beginning. Defeating Zorvak made him a target, and there were plenty of students eager to take him down to reclaim the status quo. During lunch, Nate found a quiet corner in the vast cafeteria, which was more like an intergalactic food court with sections catering to different species' dietary needs. Floating trays zipped through the air, carrying everything from nutrient sludges to glowing fruits. As Nate poked at his food, a tasteless protein cube that supposedly met human nutritional requirements, he was joined by a familiar face. Nate, there you are, Jex, the hyperactive Nixian, bounded over, his fur practically bristling with excitement. You're all over the neural net. Everyone's talking about you. Some are even calling you Zorvak's Bane. Isn't that awesome? Nate smirked. Yeah, awesome isn't exactly the word I'd use. Now I've got half the school either gunning for me or waiting to see me mess up. Jex's eyes went wide. Are you serious? I mean, sure, some of Zorvak's goons are mad, but they're always mad about something. Still, you've got fans now, too. You should check out the human appreciation thread on the net. It's blowing up. Before Nate could respond, a shadow fell over their table. He looked up to see 3 towering figures glaring down at him. At the center was Renkor, a hulking creature with armor-plated skin and spikes running down his back. Renkor was one of Zorvak's closest cronies, and his scowl made it clear he wasn't here to congratulate Nate. So you think you're something special? Ha, Renkor's voice was like grinding stone. One lucky fight, and now you think you're hot stuff. Nate sighed, setting his fork down. He knew this was coming. Look, I'm not looking for trouble. But if you're here to test me, you're going to be disappointed. Renkor bared his fangs in what might have been a grin. Oh, I'm not here to fight. Yet. I'm just here to remind you that Zorvak isn't done with you. He's biding his time, waiting for the right moment to pay you back. But until then, we'll be watching. With that, Renkor and his gang turned and walked away, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Jex let out a breath he'd been holding. That was intense. You think they're serious? Nate nodded. Oh, they're serious. Zorvak's not the type to let something like this go. He's probably planning his next move as we speak. Jex's fur drooped slightly. You know, you don't have to do this alone. There are plenty of students who'd back you up if you asked. Maybe even form a coalition against Zorvak and his crew. Nate shook his head. I appreciate it, Jex, but I'm not interested in starting a war. I just want to make it through this year without getting crushed. Jex's eyes sparkled mischievously. Still, it wouldn't hurt to have some friends watching your back. If you're not interested in a full-on coalition, at least consider hanging out with some of the more resourceful students. I've got connections, you know. Nate raised an eyebrow. Connections. Jex leaned in, his voice lowering conspiratorially. Let's just say there are groups here that operate under the radar. Not everything is as simple as Zorvak and his goons throwing their weight around. Some of us prefer to stay out of sight but still make moves behind the scenes. If you're interested, I could introduce you. Nate considered the offer. It wasn't like he was opposed to making alliances, but he wasn't keen on getting caught up in some underworld drama either. Still, it wouldn't hurt to know more about the different factions at Galacta-High. All right, he said. I'm listening. Later that day, after classes had ended, Nate followed Jex to a secluded section of the school's lower levels. The halls here were dimly lit, with flickering lights casting long shadows that danced across the walls. It was a stark contrast to the vibrant, bustling upper floors, and it was clear this was the part of Galacta-High where most students didn't venture without good reason. Jex stopped in front of a large door guarded by a pair of gruff-looking aliens with mechanical limbs and glowing eyes. They exchanged a few words in a language Nate didn't understand before stepping aside to let them through. Inside, the room was a hive of activity. Students of various species were gathered in small groups, discussing everything from black market tech to underground hoverball tournaments. The walls were covered in holo-graffiti, some of it animated and shifting as Nate watched. A few students glanced up at him, curious, but most were too busy with their own business to pay him much attention. This, Jex said proudly, is the Den. It's where those of us who prefer to operate off the grid come to trade info, make deals, and keep tabs on what's happening around the school. It's also the place where you can find out who's got beef with who and where you can settle scores quietly. Nate took it all in. He'd expected something more sinister, but this felt more like an underground community, a place where students who didn't fit into the usual cliques could find allies. It was chaotic, but there was an odd sense of camaraderie here too. Jex led him to a table where a tall, willowy alien with translucent skin and 3 eyes was sitting. The alien's eyes rotated independently, taking in the room even as it focused on the conversation at hand. Jex introduced it as Alara, a broker of sorts who specialized in gathering information. Nate, ha, Alara said, its voice melodious but tinged with amusement. You're the talk of the school. Zorvak's not used to being bested, especially not by a human. I have to say, you've got some impressive moves for a species that's considered low tier in the galactic pecking order. Nate shrugged. Just doing what I have to do to survive. Ilara's eyes gleamed with interest. Surviving is one thing. Thriving is another. I hear you've got a knack for outthinking your opponents. That kind of skill could be valuable around here if you're willing to make the right connections. Nate narrowed his eyes. What kind of connections are we talking about? Ilara leaned in closer. Information, for one. There's a lot going on at Galacta-High that doesn't make it to the surface. You think Zorvak's the biggest threat here? He's nothing compared to some of the other players in this school. You've got shadow syndicates, tech smugglers, even covert operatives planted by rival academies, and they're all vying for control of the power vacuum that's starting to form. Nate felt a chill run down his spine. You're telling me this place is more than just a school? Alara smiled, a thin, knowing grin. It's a battleground, but not in the way you think. Zorvak and his kind are just the muscle brute force with no real subtlety. The real power is in information, leverage, and alliances. You showed everyone yesterday that you're not to be underestimated. Now you have a choice. Stay in the spotlight and keep fending off challengers. Or learn to navigate the shadows where the real decisions are made. Nate considered Alara's words. He hadn't expected Galacta-High to be this complicated. He'd been ready for bullies and rivalries, but an entire underworld of secret deals and hidden agendas. That was a whole new level. What's the catch? Nate asked, crossing his arms. Alara's smile widened. The catch is simple. Once you're in, you're in. If you start playing the game, you can't just walk away when it gets too hot. You'll have to make tough choices, sometimes without knowing all the consequences. But in return, you'll gain access to resources, allies, and information that could keep you a step ahead of anyone trying to take you down, including Zorvak. Nate glanced at Jex, who gave him an encouraging nod. It's up to you, Jex said. No pressure, but it's better to have options than to be out here alone. Nate took a deep breath. This was a lot to process, but he wasn't naive. He knew that if Zorvak was gunning for him, he'd need more than just quick reflexes and clever tricks to stay ahead. He'd need allies and access to information. All right, Nate said finally, I'm in. Ilara's eyes twinkled with approval. Good choice. First things first, let's get you familiar with the players. There are a few key groups you'll need to keep an eye on. Over the next few days, Nate became a regular in the den. He quickly learned that Galacta-High was far more than the chaotic melting pot it appeared to be on the surface. Beneath the layers of typical high school cliques and rivalries was a network of factions, each with their own agendas. Ilara acted as his guide, introducing him to the movers and shakers within the den. There was the Techris Syndicate, a group of students who specialized in acquiring and selling cutting-edge tech, often stuff that wasn't exactly legal. Then there were the Splicers, biohackers who experimented with gene modification, offering enhancements for the right price. And of course there was the Whisper Circle, a shadowy group that traded exclusively in information and secrets. But the most intriguing faction was one that operated entirely in the shadows, the Silent Order. Alara explained that the Silent Order was a group of elite students trained in stealth, strategy, and subterfuge. They rarely engaged in direct confrontation, preferring to manipulate events from behind the scenes. No one knew exactly who was in the Order, but their influence was undeniable. Nate found himself drawn to the Whisper Circle. If information was power, then knowing what was going on before everyone else was key to staying ahead. He began trading favors, offering insights in exchange for access to the Circle's database. With Jex's help, he quickly gained a reputation as someone who could be trusted with sensitive intel. One day, while scanning through the Whisper Circle's logs, Nate came across a file labeled Project Harbinger. It was encrypted, but something about it piqued his curiosity. He was about to dig deeper when Alara appeared beside him, her eyes narrowing as she noticed what he was looking at. "I wouldn't mess with that if I were you," Alara warned, her voice serious. "Project Harbinger is off limits, even for the Circle. It's tied to some very dangerous people." Nate's curiosity only grew. "What is it?" Alara shook her head. "All I know is it's connected to one of the Academy's covert divisions. Rumor has it they're experimenting with weaponized students' enhancements, implants, mind control, that sort of thing. But trust me, that's one rabbit hole you don't want to go down." Nate nodded, filing the information away for later. The more he learned about Galacta-High, the clearer it became that his original plan of laying low wasn't going to work. If he wanted to survive and maybe even thrive, he'd need to adapt. Just when Nate thought things were starting to settle down, Zorvak made his move. It was subtle at first, whispers in the hallways, strange looks from students who usually ignored him. But soon it became clear that Zorvak was laying the groundwork for something big. One afternoon, as Nate was leaving xenobiology, he was cornered by a group of students led by Renkor. This time, they weren't just issuing threats. "You've made quite a name for yourself," Human Renkor said, his voice dripping with malice. "But Zorvak's done playing around. He wants a rematch, no tricks this time. You and him in the pit." Nate's heart raced. The pit was notorious a combat arena deep within the school, officially off limits but frequently used for settling grudges. Fights there were no holds barred, and there were no rules. "Why should I agree to that?" Nate asked, keeping his voice steady. Renkor grinned, showing his sharp teeth. "Because if you don't, we'll make sure you're too broken to say no. Either way, you're going into the pit. It's just a matter of when." Nate clenched his fists. He'd known this was coming, but he hadn't expected it so soon. Still, he couldn't back down now. If he refused, Zorvak's gang would hound him until he had no choice but to fight, likely when he was at his weakest. "Fine," Nate said, his voice cold. "Tell Zorvak I'll see him in the pit." Renkor's grin widened. "Good, we'll be watching." As the group walked away, Nate felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Jex looking worried. "Are you sure about this, Nate? The pit's no joke. They'll be out for blood." "I know," Nate replied, his mind already racing with strategies. "But I don't have a choice. If I'm going to end this, I need to do it on my terms." Jex nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "Just be careful, okay? And don't forget you've got people who've got your back. You're not alone in this." Nate smiled. "Thanks, Jex, I'll keep that in mind." As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The pit would be the ultimate test, not just of his skills, but of everything he'd learned since coming to Galacta-High. He'd need more than gadgets and clever tricks this time. He'd need to outthink Zorvak in a fight where the rules didn't exist. But Nate was ready. He'd come to Galacta-High as an outsider, a lone human in a school where strength was king. Now he had allies, information, and the experience to back him up. The rematch with Zorvak wouldn't be like last time. This time it would be for everything.